Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll continue our reading of The American Slave Coast, A History of the Slave Breeding Industry by Ned and Constance Subletti. Now, remember, this show is part of a podcasting network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network, such as Oni Tase from the Pro Black Perspective, Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, D Webb from the Harsh Reality Podcast, The Forecast from the Forecast Radio broadcast. There's Cassidra Cheek from the Cassidra Cheek Show and Brother Bakari from the Black Business Network. We are all hosts on the KWAZ Radio Broadcasting Network. Now, I want you to remember that this information is copywritten, and I'm not trying to infringe upon anyone's copyright. I'm just expounding upon the information that they wrote, and I'm sitting here trying to give us a little bit of context about this information. I will make enunciation mistakes, and I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source. Chapter 21, The General Inconvenience, starts with a quote from Thomas Jefferson's memorandum book, dated January 29th, 1773. He's documenting sold Sandy to Colonel Chas Lewis for £100, payable in June, from which deduct £9, 4 shillings, and 8 pence, my present debt with him, which leaves £90, 15 shillings, and 4 pence to be received. So Thomas Jefferson was meticulous at documenting how much he was owed for the slaves that he sold. Patrick Henry was, by accounts, a fiddler, a good one at that, a singer of tavern ballads, and an engaging character. Jefferson, who first encountered him in 1760 when Henry's store had failed, recalled that his manners had something of coarseness in them. His passion was music, dancing, and pleasantry. He excelled at the latter, and it attached everyone to him. A slave owning tobacco planter and seditious orator, Henry strikingly personifies the fundamental paradox of the early American experience: how liberty could be intimately bound up with slavery. Give me liberty or give me death was Henry's hyperdramatic rhetorical ultimatum, the most popular and durable slogan of the independence movement. Subsequently venerated as a patriotic scripture, was in support of what was basically his own declaration of war against Britain, arguing in favor of placing the entire state on an emergency mobilization. Henry's speech has been widely credited with moving Virginia to declare independence from Britain. It took place, so we are told, though there's no contemporary record of it, on March 20th, 1775, from the third pew of the left central section of St. John's Church in Richmond. Hoping to avoid escalation of hostilities, the pro American Irish statesman Edmund Burke warned in a speech given in London 2 days after Henry's peroration that in Virginia and the Carolinas, they have a vast multitude of slaves. These people of the southern colonies are much more strongly and with a higher and more stubborn spirit attached to liberty than those to the northward. Such will be all masters of slaves who are not slaves themselves. In such a people, the haughtiness of domination combines with the spirit of freedom, fortifies it, and renders it invincible. It required 5 weeks minimum and often much longer for a message to travel from America to England. So Burke's speech was not a direct response to Henry, but his words described Henry perfectly. Henry's polemical evocations of liberty and slavery were framed by his concrete daily experience of denying the most basic freedoms to an entire community of people over whom his word was law, and who lived in misery at his grudging expense. Henry's famous line was worked and reworked from Joseph Addison's Cato, which was a play that the founders of the American Republic knew well. Written in 1712 and published in 1713, Cato might be understood as a parable. Britain, once a vassal of the Roman Empire, was now the center of an empire molded and modeled on Rome. Addison's sober neoclassical tragedy of liberty versus tyranny was set in Mediterranean North Africa, with Roman exiles as the heroes. The word Africa is heard frequently in the mouths of the actors in Cato, perhaps for its resonant value, though the play is ambiguous about it. By Addison's time, London coffee houses were getting coffee from Martinique. The transformation that African labor in the colonies had wrought in the metropolitan economies lurked offstage as well as on stage. The African character Juba is a figure out of history, the king of Numidia, which is Algeria. Then, under the control of the Carthaginians, when Juba wants the hand of Cato's daughter Marcia, Cato responds with a non answer to his request, saying, "It is not now the time to talk of aught but chains or conquest, liberty or death." Arguably the most politically consequential play in the history of British theater, Cato was carefully bipartisan and scrupulously inoffensive. At its premiere, Whigs and Tories competed to applaud the loudest at the mention of the word liberty. To be a patriot, a son of liberty, a free man and not a slave, that was a British oratorical legacy, imperial in scope and carried over to the colonies. In England, writes Bernard Bailyn, a flood of what has been called Whig panegyric verse poured from the presses from 1700 to 1760 and echoed from the stage in play after play. No writer, however famous or obscure, could afford to neglect the theme of British liberty and power. Greetings, Sister Raw, and the elders listening with you. I'm so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. The Americans saw themselves as Cato's conspirators, called to sacrifice against a British Caesar. The first professional theater companies in the colonies performed Cato. Excerpts of his soliloquies were printed in colonial newspapers. It was staged by students at William and Mary College. Benjamin Franklin could recite chunks of it from memory, with its line, "What a pity it is that we can die but once to serve our country," proved inspirational for the martyred Nathan Hale. George Washington, who saw Cato various times, referred to it in letters and had it performed near the front lines at Valley Forge on May 11, 1778, within earshot of the British troops. There's a good reason modern audiences have not seen Cato. It's not Shakespeare. Today, it would seem stiff, stilted, and interminable, a celebration of stoicism in the face of tyranny. It lacks complex characters. Cato is noble and good. Caesar, the villain, is an unseen oppressor who has no part in the drama. Amateur theatrics were popular in the isolation of Plantation, Virginia, and Cato was, writes Jane Carson, a favorite vehicle for amateurs because it requires little acting ability. The characters simply strike an attitude and declaim noble sentiments in the high flowing oratory. Patrick Henry was something of a ham actor, notes biographer George F. Willison. And as he gave his riveting oration in Richmond, he dramatized it. Not that we know exactly what he said, unlike Jefferson, who, even as president, declined to speak in public but left us a massive record of his thought in written form. Henry's most famous words live today only as hand me downs. There is no contemporaneous transcription of the full text. What follows, likely assembled from a collection of jurists, St. George Tucker, was published 17 years after Henry's death. And it says, "It is vain, sir, to extenuate the matter. Gentlemen may cry peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war is actually begun. Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." When Henry shouted, "Give me liberty," he paused for effect and poised a letter opener with his right hand pointed at his chest. It was an ivory letter opener, a product of Africa. When he said, "Or give me death," he thumped his right hand containing the letter opener of death against his breast, as if stabbing himself. John Roan, who was present, recalled that when he said, "Life so dear," or "peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains of slavery," he stood in the attitude of a condemned galley slave, loaded with fetters, awaiting his doom. His form was bowed, his wrists were crossed, his manacles were almost visible. Patrick Henry knew what a manacled slave looked like. He had received 6 people as a wedding present from his father in law and later sold them to raise money to set himself up in an ill fated storekeeping venture. For that matter, slaves were routinely sold in front of the Virginia House of Burgesses in Williamsburg, where a fair weather auction outside would have been audible through the open windows of the building. Henry's bound slave gesture can be read as an example of how the struggle for independence from Britain branded itself as a revolution against tyranny. To judge from the writings and recorded speeches of the self proclaimed patriots, they were obsessed with slavery. As per a New York protest of 1770, typical of the genre, the right of a people to tax themselves is essential to their liberty, and the power of imposing taxes on them, when exercised by others, subjects that people to the most abject slavery. If you can recount some of the things that Forecast says, this is his opinion and opining about that situation, because we are taxed here, but we are taxed by others, and those taxes do not benefit us. So we are slaves because we're subject to the taxation of this country, even based on those of the Revolutionary War. The word slave turns up repeatedly in their discourse as the essence of what they would never allow themselves to become. This was nothing new. Describing those in opposition to oneself in terms of slavery and freedom was an ingrained English trope of at least 2 centuries by then, heard routinely from the pulpit in sermons of every denomination. Henry's liberty or death message carried the clear blame the victim implication that those who submitted to slavery were unworthy of liberty. The protest against Britain was thus dubbed as a taunt at the colonists' enslaved laborers. It was a libel routinely asserted against African Americans that they were complicit in their degradation. So, according to Henry's perspective, we were complicit in our own enslavement because they enslaved us forcibly and used violence to continue to keep us and terror to continue to keep us enslaved. But it was our own fault. Meanwhile, the use of slavery as a political fighting word continued in use in England as well. Shall our fate be national bankruptcy, poverty, oppression, and slavery? Asked in a 1772 London pamphlet castigating the East India Company. Looking at a dismal future as a colony in which their sole purpose would be to enrich Britain, the wealthy North American colonial elite saw an analogy with the way the slave only existed for the benefit of the master. But the word slavery did not only compel colonials as an abstract metaphor, the Americans brought something different to the use of the term. For those who were born into full fledged slave society as masters, some of their most profound, complex, and unrestrained relationships were with their slaves. So they had a history of entangling and intertwining themselves with their slaves, with their property, with these people that had no agency of their own. Henry owned slaves when he was sermonizing radical, and he owned them when he was the first governor of independent Virginia, where he was second in popularity only to George Washington. Like other liberty loving Virginians, he bewailed the necessity of having slaves. Henry acknowledged the contradiction in a 1773 letter to his Virginia planter friend, Robert Pleasants. A devout Quaker, Pleasants had educated and freed his slaves at an enormous personal cost of more than £5,000, which would be more than $700,000 in 2014 money, and sent Henry an anti slavery book. Would anyone believe, asked Henry rhetorically, I am master of slaves of my own purchase? I am drawn along by the general inconvenience of living here without them. I will not, I cannot justify it. This was, it should be emphasized, in a private letter. There is no record of his expressing such sentiments publicly. I believe a time will come, the letter continued, when an opportunity will be offered to abolish this lamentable evil. I could say many things on this subject, a serious view of which gives a gloomy perspective to future times. So he was thinking that even when the slaves were free, that it would be gloomy times for the master class, for the white people, for the slave owning class, because they would have to run their own households. They would have to cook for themselves and feed their own children. And white women would have to sucker their own babies. And they would have to do all the work that these enslaved people had to been doing for them. His gloomy perspective was well founded. The general inconvenience of living without slaves would have meant not merely having to empty one's own slop jar, which is your poop jar, your pee jar. It would have meant not living on the capital they embodied. Ending slavery would have required a different kind of revolution than the one Henry championed. The liberty that Henry Patrick was willing to trade for death, not his own martyrdom as it turned out, others did the dying, but that liberty that he was willing to trade for death was, as his other discourses and letters bear out, the freedom to own, which inescapably meant the freedom to breed and sell slaves. Henry's revolution did nothing to change the slaves' status as chattel or creditors' valuation of them as collateral. Whether or not Henry believed, as he wrote to Pleasance, that the time for abolition would someday come, he clearly believed it had not come yet, and he worked to delay it until long after his generation had departed. Henry argued against freeing slaves, even as he dramatized the evils of slavery, saying slavery is detested in a letter, also saying, "We feel its fatal effects. We deplore it with all the pity of humanity. We ought to lament and deplore the necessity of holding our fellow man in bondage. But it is practicable by any human means to liberate them without producing the most dreadful and ruinous consequences. So he thought that it would be hard for them to integrate into society because they kept slaves in such deplorable status. They felt that they needed to be governors and guardians of their enslaved population. Was it practicable? It would indeed have been possible to free the slaves voluntarily. Thousands of slave owners did, including Robert Pleasance, the Quaker, in some cases because they got religion, and in others simply because they despised the slave system they had been born into as hereditary slave owners. But it was not practicable, not because, as Henry, Jefferson, and most other slave owners assumed, freeing the slaves would unleash the criminality they believed was inherent in the enslaved, but because to do so would have made their former owners poor. That is the only reason they didn't want to let go of slaves, because the land that they were given was valueless without the enslaved people to work the land. They could go in there and create profit just by raping women. To manumit one's slaves was to make a ruinous financial sacrifice. Without slaves, Virginia would be destitute. With them, she was the wealthiest of the states. With slavery having been built into the deepest levels of the colonial economy during the 17th century, there was no way to get rid of it by Patrick Henry's time, short of all the slave owners voluntarily impoverishing themselves. The historical record amply demonstrates that most slave owners were not only not willing to do this, but would hurl the poorer class of their society against cannonballs first. So these rich white people would sacrifice poor white people before getting rid of their slaves because their slaves held all their wealth. That the War of Independence resulted in the strengthening, not the termination of slavery, was not an unexpected outcome for Southerners. Protecting slavery had been the point of the war for them. It was the principal Southern political goal at every moment until slavery was destroyed. So when they say that the South and that the Civil War was not about slavery, it was all about slavery. Okay? It was all about slavery. Here's to the next insurrection of Negroes in the West Indies, said the proudly anti American Dr. Samuel Johnson as he offered a toast at Oxford. In a 13,000 word pamphlet called Taxation, No Tyranny, that mocked the inflated rhetoric of the colonists in the last days before the war. He wrote in the spring of 1775, "How is it we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of Negroes?" Patrick Henry, the loudest of all the voices for liberty, was the perfect example for the colonists being caricatured by Johnson. Though no one who heard Henry orate ever described his voice as a yelp, Dr. Johnson continued his essay by proposing to arm the colonists' slaves. It has been proposed that the slaves should be set free, an act which surely the lovers of liberty cannot but commend. If they are furnished with firearms for defense and utensils for husbandry and settled in some simple form of government within the country, they may be more grateful and honest than their masters. So, again, these white people that were off in England, the elite and wealthy over there, were thinking that to destroy the elite and wealthy in America, that they would arm the slaves. And that's what Lord Dunmore was trying to do as well. As Dr. Johnson knew full well, though, the colonial tax protesters might feel emboldened to stand up to London, their more serious threat came from closer at home. After Dunmore's proclamation, which put the idea espoused by Dr. Johnson into practice, enslaved people in Virginia began voting with their feet. By December 23rd, 1775, Henry was writing Edmund Pendleton, who, as president of the Virginia Committee of Safety, was Virginia's highest ranking official from Williamsburg, saying, "Sir, I have the pleasure to inform you that we have taken a vessel of the government bound to the eastern shore for provisions, commanded by Captain Collett and manned with 13 Negroes." Not only the government, but Negroes were Henry's enemies in war. The enslaved overwhelmingly sided not with Henry's vision of liberty, which was their slavery, but with the British, who offered them freedom. But remember, they weren't being offered a true freedom, because only healthy men that were able and willing to fight were eligible for this freedom. They often had to make the decision between leaving their families behind and being freed themselves, or remaining enslaved and staying with their family and hoping that their enslaving master would allow them to retain their family and familial ties that they had on the plantation. The paradox of liberty versus slavery at the nation's birth is no paradox at all. Liberty was the right to property, and slaves were property. Liberty for slave owners meant slavery for slaves. Viewed from the slave owner's perspective, liberty was slavery. It was made much easier by, indeed almost required by, believing something that resonated with the Calvinist doctrine of predestination. Those who were enslaved were those who were naturally inferior. Do you hear this? This Calvinist doctrine, this predestination idea that if you're born a certain way and into a certain class of people, you're naturally inferior. God had made them that way for a reason, and they were easy to visually identify. In Thomas Jefferson's celebrated reworking of George Mason's "All men are by nature equally free and independent" into the catchier, more deistic "All men are created equal," the 33-year-old Virginia was not envisioning a republic in which Barack Obama would be president. In Jefferson's society, Black people did not have the legal status as people. Personhood, we call it now, that Lord Mansfield had acknowledged in the Somerset case. The later pro-slavery propagandists of the Confederacy were right in insisting that, like them, Jefferson did not intend those words to mean all men. And when you talk to people that say, oh, what was the intention of the framers of the Constitution? What were the founders' thoughts? The founders were not thinking of Black people as full people. They were thinking of Black people as three-fifths of a person, as beasts of burden. They recognized that they needed to count them so that the Southern states had more power, which is where the three-fifths compromise came into place. But the reality of the situation is that the founders and the framers never meant Black people to be a part of this men that they were talking about. This is not merely a statement about Jefferson's psychology. There was an existing framework for interpretation of the phrase. When George Mason wrote his version of the phrase as part of the preamble to the new Virginia Constitution, it met with objections from planters who saw it as an incitation to slave rebellions. Donald L. Robinson writes, defenders of Mason's language replied that the clause could not have this effect because it did not apply to Negroes, since Negroes were not constituent members of the society being formed. Nor did anyone think it applied to Native Americans. All men did not mean all men, and more than it meant women, but it was a politically useful phrase since those opposed to slavery could read into it what they wanted. In drafting the document, his authorship of it was generally not known at the time. Jefferson needed to please the French, who wanted a political commitment on the American part before they would turn and commit to an overt war against Britain in America yet again, after having gotten kicked off the continent not 20 years before. Though Britain's naval power was supreme, its army boasted nowhere near the manpower of France's, which was the largest in Europe. Nor, despite the citation of it 7 years later in Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, was Jefferson declaring the existence of a new nation. The Declaration announced the birth of, in Gary Will's words, not one country, but 13 separate ones that were forced to form a league in order to attract foreign aid for the war they were fighting together. So this was never supposed to be a nation in and of itself that was bartering together and organized together, but it was a confederation of different states and colonies of different territories that were coming together to solicit the help of foreign powers in order to fight Great Britain. This is why they talk about states' rights so much. So we are 50 individual countries that come together under the banner of the United States of America in an attempt to garner foreign aid and to levy for our power throughout the nation, throughout the world. Jefferson's document was not the legal Declaration of Independence. That had been made by the Continental Congress on July 2nd, with the passage of the Virginian Richard Henry Lee's resolution that these united colonies were free and independent states, and note the plural. Jefferson's declaration, which took on a mythical glow with the passage of years, announced the passage of Lee's resolution. The French participation in the American uprising took 2 more years to codify in the Commercial Treaty of February 6, 1778. So the fact that it took them 2 extra years to organize this treaty, this commercial treaty, lets you know that it's all about commerce and business. That's why you have so many people saying, oh, under the United Commercial Code, you need to do this or you need to do that. But in reality, you need to liberate yourself and find a way that you are generating income for yourself, by yourself, in an attempt to avoid the taxes that they're trying to levy against you and enslave you with, and stay away from debt, because that's just another opportunity to enslave you. If you are not going to college in order to get a technical skill and degree, then you need to look and see what other things you can do, what other training you can get, because college is a scam if you're just going for an art degree. Despite Jefferson's expressed misgivings about slavery during his early years and his frequently quoted bits of anti slavery sounding rhetoric and philosophical reflection, his actions make it clear where he stood on the subject in practical terms. African Americans in Republican Virginia were property, period. He did his best to sound like a French philosopher when he inserted the words life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But whether Jefferson's captives, whom he described as laboring for his happiness, lived at his mountaintop prison of Monticello or on one of his other parcels of land, they had no right even to keep their own children, though they were mostly allowed to. Nor did Jefferson at any time express any intention of ultimately extending the franchise to them, ever. What is the franchise? The right to vote, the right to be free, the right to be self-determining. He at no point in time expressed any interest in giving personhood to his enslaved capital. And he only allowed them to keep their children because it increased his bottom line. Because every child that he brought in, although they at first had some level of debt, maybe 2, 3 thousand pounds worth of debt that they would suck up, and resources that they would suck up before they became profitable, if he trained them, or if he used them as a secured interest, he could levy that and get credit and debt and go in and get more money because of these enslaved people that he owned. In his draft of the Declaration, Jefferson included a complaint against the king for the slave trade, saying, he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce. Then he evoked the terrorism of Lord Dunmore, saying, and that this assemblage of horrors might want to know fact of distinguished dye, he is now exciting those very people to rise up in arms among us and to purchase that liberty of which he had deprived them, and murdering the people upon whom he obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with the crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. So, what Thomas Jefferson was saying was that Now that there's a problem with the colonists, you want to arm their slaves so that they can rise up and kill the colonists. And you took these slaves from other parts of the world because you too participated in the slave trade. And now that you want to liberate yourself from the guilt of having enslaved these people and remove them from their home, you want to turn them against their masters. It was slickly done. The slave owner denied all American agency in slavery. He threw all the blame for the slave trade on Britain, thereby exonerating the slave ship captains of Rhode Island, the many slave dealers throughout the colonies, and the eager buyers who patronized slave sales. The slave trade was an easy target. It was genuinely unpopular, and not only for its sheer ugliness. The traffic to North America was mostly conducted by British ships, with a corresponding loss of profit to Americans. It was out of the control of colonial legislators, which at times wanted to regulate the supply of Africans on the market by shutting it off. Every slave ship from Africa lowered the resale values of slaves already in the colonies, those homegrown slaves that came from the breeding farms. And Virginia already had an oversupply. The arrival of so many Africans was terrifying to the non slave owning majority of whites who tended to see them the way they were generally portrayed in the political discourse of the day, as a socially destabilizing and potentially violent element. Though Jefferson cloaked his complaint in moral dress, which is Robinson's term, it was a complaint against the African slave trade, not against slavery itself. And that was where he was very clear and very slick in the way that he presented it, because he was opposed to external slaves coming in and lowering the price and the value of these internal slaves that they already had, that they were breeding in and of themselves here in the Americas. But the section was struck out at the instance of the congressmen from South Carolina and Georgia who were not against the slave trade at all. While Jefferson was a member of the Virginia House of Delegates between 1776 and 1779, he obtained a prohibition of the slave trade into the state, but tellingly not out of it. That means that they couldn't bring any new slaves in, but they could export slaves out. This was a way, this is also a way for them to capture a market by saying, we can sell these slaves to you, but we can't accept any slaves from you. One of his best known achievements of those years was his successful campaign to end the aristocratic institution of primogeniture, meaning the first son received the entire inheritance, and entail land holdings, which and entail land holdings could not be broken up in Virginia. Georgia was the first state to ban primogeniture and entail entirely in its Constitution of 1777. All the other states prohibited them as well. Though these institutions were not vigorously enforced in Virginia at the time of their prohibition, abolishing primogeniture and entail was unquestionably a democratizing move for whites. But the resulting distribution of land among more men of the family, and thus the franchise for only men of property could vote, meant breaking up more Black families who were divided up along with the estate. So, what he's saying here is that previously, the oldest son got everything. They got the land, they got the slaves, they got the property, they got the businesses, they got the titles. But that meant that only the oldest son had the right to vote. And so what they did is they did away with that law and they said, we're going to break up property evenly amongst the sons. Okay. This is still not for women, but amongst the sons. Now we're going to give other males in the family the right to vote when this older person dies. So they evenly broke it up. And because a slave family might be 5 people, but this oldest son is only entitled to 2 slaves or 3 slaves, that family got broken up and divided as well, unless that younger son or that older son could buy out or purchase this particular these particular slaves, unless they had capital to cover the cost of these slaves to keep that family together. And often it wasn't in their best interest to keep the families together, because with that type of cultural continuity, then rebellions would happen more often. Jefferson's biographer, Dumas Malone, recalled in 1967 his conversation with a traditional Virginia lady more than 40 years ago. This grand dame began by asserting that Mr. Jefferson undermined the family. Her reference was to the abolition of entails and primogeniture, which were supposed to safeguard family estates and family lines. Continuing, he wrecked the church, the reference being to the disestablishment in Virginia shortly after the American Revolution. In fact, she triumphantly concluded, the only decent institution he left us was slavery. This flurry of lawmaking could have proceeded along a different line than it did. The Virginia delegates did not throw out the established body of law and create a new one from scratch. Instead, they retained and modified the existing law regarding slavery. John Quincy Adams commented retrospectively on the process in 1831, saying, the principle of setting aside the whole code of their legislation would have itself been emancipated all of their slaves. In renovating their code, they must have restored slavery after having abolished it. They must have assumed to themselves all of the odium of establishing it as a positive constitution directly in the face of all the principles that they had proclaimed. It was easier to abolish the law of primogeniture. The bill on the subject of slaves was a mere digest of the existing laws respecting them, without any imitation of a plan for future and general emancipation. Mr. Jefferson contents himself with a posthumous prophecy that emancipation must soon come, or that worse will follow. Partus sequitur ventrum came through the revolution intact, as did the rest of the Virginia law regarding slaves, by all of which had been made by Virginia House of Burgesses, and none of which was British law. When Patrick Henry was governor of Virginia at war in 1777, he signed a bill written by Jefferson to regulate and discipline the militia. Every free man in Virginia was expected to join it, including indentured servants and freemen of color, with a list of exceptions, professors at William and Mary College, for example. Jefferson stipulated that the free mulattoes in the said companies or battalions shall be employed as drummers, fifers, or pioneers, which meant that men of color were to be required to participate in combat but were not to have guns. Lord Dunmore had offered freedom to the enslaved and military commissions, But the best Jefferson could do was to put free people of color on the battlefield as pioneers. That word may evoke covered wagons to some, but its prior military use meant those who went out in front of the army to dig trenches, one of the most dangerous positions. A pioneer, etymologically related to a pawn or peon, and is roughly synonymous with the French militia term avant garde. Virginia's militia, according to Jefferson, was to be an all white force except for the musicians and the free black avant garde, who were not to have weapons to defend themselves with. Writing from Charlottesville on January 20th, 1779, Thomas Anbury, a lieutenant in the British Army who kept an extensive journal and who was clearly not a sympathetic observer, described in detail the typical Virginia planter as an idle character, then went on to outline the workday, saying, "It is the poor Negroes who alone work hard, and I am sorry to say, fairly hard. Incredible is the fatigue which the poor wretches undergo, and that nature should be able to support it. There certainly must be something in their constitutions as well as their color different from us that enables them to do it. They are called up at daybreak and seldom allowed to swallow a mouthful of hominy or a hoe cake, but are drawn out into the field immediately, where they continue at hard labor without intermission, till noon, when they go to their dinners, and are seldom allowed an hour for that purpose. Their meals consist of hominy and salt, and if their master is a man of humanity, touched by the finer things of love and sensibility, he allows them twice a week a little fat skimmed milk, rusty bacon, or salt herring, to relish this miserable and scanty fare. The man at his plantation, in lieu of these, grants his Negroes an acre of ground and all Saturday afternoon to raise grain and poultry for themselves. After they have dined, they return to labor in the field until dusk in the evening. Here, one naturally imagines the daily labor of these poor creatures was over. Not so. They repair the tobacco houses, where each has a task of stripping allotted, which takes them some hours, or else they have such a quantity of Indian corn to husk, and if they neglect it, are tied up in the morning and receive a number of lashes from those unfeeling monsters, the overseers, whose masters suffered them to exercise their brutal authority without constraint. Thus, by their night task, it is late in the evening before these poor creatures return to their second scanty meal, and the time taken up as it encroaches upon their sleep hours, which for refreshment of food and sleep together can never be reckoned to exceed 8. When they lay themselves down to rest, their comforts are equally miserable and limited, for they sleep on a bench or on the ground with an old scanty blanket which serves them at once for bed and covering. Their clothing is no less wretched, consisting of a shirt and trousers of coarse, thin, hard hempen stuff. So, hemp was their material, and in the summer, with an addition of a very coarse wool jacket, breeches, and shoes in the winter. But since the war, their masters, for they cannot get the clothing as usual, suffered them to go in rags, and many in a state of nudity. The female slaves share labor and repose just in the same manner, except a few who are termed house Negroes and are employed in the household drudgery. These poor creatures are all submission to inquiries and insults and are obliged to be passive. Dare not they resist or defend themselves if attacked without the smallest provocation by a white person. In 1779, at the urging of Thomas Jefferson, who at this time had been elected the governor of Virginia, the state's capital was moved inland from Williamsburg to Richmond, farther away from Washington's home turf and closer to Jefferson's. In the first days of 1780, Jefferson and his family fled Richmond for Monticello with his wife Martha Wales Jefferson, had an infant in her arms to escape Benedict Arnold's troops as they entered the new capital. The British began a victorious 40-day siege of Charlestown on March 5th, 1780, and after the city surrendered en masse, they occupied the city until the end of 1782 for almost 3 years, with an army whose ranks included, to the white population's great discomfort, armed black men. Escaped slaves to occupy Charlestown to seek refuge. Lord Charles Cornwallis invaded Virginia in 1781, plundered and bringing liberated slaves along in an entourage that was larger than any town in Virginia. But from there, he went directly on to defeat at Yorktown. During that invasion, shortly after Jefferson's term as governor had expired, the Jeffersons, Martha was pregnant, fled the British again, this time from their home in Monticello to escape a troop led by Cornwallis's lieutenant, Colonel Banster, Bloody Tarleton. Adding to the insult, Cornwallis used Monticello as a base for a few days while the Jeffersons hid. It was as close to being in combat as Jefferson ever came, unless you count peering through the Venetian blinds in his carriage in the streets of Paris in 1789. He was subsequently called on to defend his alleged cowardice as governor in a formal proceeding, which Jefferson believed to have been instigated by Patrick Henry. 16 years later, when Jefferson was running for president against John Adams, his nemesis, Alexander Hamilton, wrote mockingly and pseudonymously of the occasion that the governor of the ancient dominion dwindled into a poor, timid philosopher, and instead of rallying his brave countrymen, he fled for safety from a few light horsemen and shamefully abandoned his trust. But then Hamilton was a bona fide war hero. Born illegitimate in Charlestown, the capital of the tiny Antillean island of Nevis, he had distinguished himself in active military service during the long War of Independence, serving as Washington's aide de camp during the horrendous winter of Valley Forge. Rising through the war in 1780, he married one of the most eligible, rich young women in New York, Elizabeth Schuyler, a slave owner. In April of 1780, George Washington received word that Louis XIV was sending his 6,000 troops in 10 ships of the line and 30 transports with one of France's most distinguished generals, Jean-Baptiste d'Anthérien de Vimour, Comte de Robichaud, at the head, all to be placed under Washington's command. Financed by Havana, the white uniformed French troops, who tripled the size of the U.S. Army, paid for their purchases in gold and silver, endearing them to local merchants. Virginia was grateful to Louis XIV, and on May 1st, Governor Jefferson signed the Virginia Assembly's charter for a new port town, Louisville, on the Ohio River, in the part of Virginia that would become Kentucky. In the late days of the war, there were various plans and proposals to arm black regiments, as in Maryland in 1781, when Charles Carroll of Carrollton wrote his father indicating he would not oppose such a measure. Nothing but exigency, exigency of the occasion and total want of money can excuse such harsh and violent measures. Henry Lawrence tried to act as though he were taking seriously his son John's proposal for a black regiment in South Carolina, but no such plan came to fruition. One of the decisive battles of the War of Independence was not fought by Americans at all. The Battle of Capes was a days long encounter at sea between Francois Joseph Paul de Grasse's French fleet, whose expedition was financed by a substantial loan from Havana because Spain also had an interest in defeating the British, and Sir Thomas Graves' smaller British fleet. Beginning September 5th, 1781, the French blockade at the north of the Chesapeake resulted in the British Navy's withdrawal to New York, cutting off Cornwallis's and his army from escape by sea. The decisive assault of the siege of Yorktown, the storming of the redoubts with bayonets on October 19th was accomplished by two stealth groups of 400 hand-picked troops that included black troops from Rhode Island Regiment on one side, commanded by Alexander Hamilton, and a French team on the other. Once the redoubts had been attacked, two columns attacked the British. George Washington led the left column and Rochambeau the right. In that decisive campaign against the British, French soldiers formed the majority of those on the battlefield. About half of the British forces were sick with malaria. Cornwallis abandoned the escaped slaves in his train, many of whom were dying. Jefferson noted that besides destroying his crops and livestock, Cornwallis carried off also about 30 slaves, 27 of whom he believed had died from smallpox and putrid fever when raging in his camp. He and his compatriots expected indemnification from the British for their property. So they were demanding payment for the lost property that was the spoils of war because they were the winning army. The Americans' southern flank in the war was covered by Louisiana's Spanish governor. The General Bernardo de Galvez, who led a group that took back West Florida, Mobile, though not East Florida, Pensacola, for Spain. A number of Galvez's troops were black. Battalions of Pardos and Morenos constituted about a third of Spain's fighting force in the Americas generally, and a number of them were what might fairly be called Cubans, though a distinct Cuban national identity did not yet exist. Negotiation for the war's end began in April of 1782, culminating in the signing in November of 1783 of the Treaty of Paris. The British side of the negotiations was led by the man George III believed to be the fittest instrument for the renewal of friendly intercourse, the slave trader Richard Oswald, who had lived in Virginia and unlike most other Britons, had a realistic notion of what America and the Americans were like. Oswald seemed to have been chosen for the part because of his acceptability to American negotiator Benjamin Franklin, to say nothing of another American negotiator, Oswald's former factor, Henry Lawrence, who arrived late in the process. Oswald allowed his old friend to insert at the last moment a clause prohibiting the carrying away of any Negroes or other property of the American inhabitants. When the treaty was ratified by the Confederation Congress in Annapolis in 1784, Lawrence was its president. Among its other accomplishments, the Treaty of Paris retroceded East Florida from the Britain to Spain. Oswald knew from experience that Florida was, in Lawrence's word, a paradise from whose bourne no money ever returns. Africans had been imported to Florida as plantation slaves during the 20 years of British rule. And during the War of Independence, the territory had been a haven for loyalist planters fleeing the war with their slaves. Now it would be Spanish again. And again, St. Augustine could be a haven for the escaped enslaved of Georgia and Carolina. So when Dr. Claude Anderson talks about the fact that slaves ran south, this is what he's talking about. Because if St. Augustine and Florida, where these plantation slaves had been, could be a haven to the enslaved people of Georgia and Carolina, this means that some slaves actually ran south. Though the treaty forbade the carrying away of human property, Sir Guy Carleton, the Irish commander-in-chief of British forces in North America, considered that those who had crossed behind British lines were free, and as soon as the spring weather of 1783 permitted, he began a flotilla that between April and November took some 3,000 of Britain's black allies to Nova Scotia beyond the reach of reenslavement. Their names were recorded in a document called the Book of Negroes. Descendants still live in Canada, mostly in Halifax. But life was difficult in Nova Scotia, and more than 1,200 of them went on to Sierra Leone in 1792. Other Black soldiers opted for military careers in the Black Carolina Corps, formally organized in 1779. A career outfit, it was evacuated to Jamaica following the defeat at Yorktown in 1781. Its success spurred the further Africanization of Britain's army in the Caribbean, leading in 1795 to the creation of the West India Regiment, a standing infantry of free Black and enslaved soldiers. In order to fill out its ranks, the British Army on occasion resorted to buying African captives off the slave ships and putting them to work as soldiers. Buying some 13,400 slaves for the purpose of being soldiers between 1795 and 1808 at the considerable cost of about £925,000. The British government became one of the largest customers of the same African trade that many in Parliament were working to abolish. So this is a part of their complicated history because they were buying slaves to be in their military. As peace negotiations got underway, some French aristocrats remained in North America, where they were the toast of society. The Marquis de Chastellux, a major general at Yorktown under Rochambeau, took Jefferson up on his invitation to visit him at Monticello. In April of 1782, where Jefferson was living in what he said was a retirement from public affairs. Costello remained at Monticello for 4 days with his entourage of 10, six of whom were servants. Martha Wells Jefferson had to provide hospitality for them. She had been pregnant almost constantly for 10 years throughout the war, and though she was, in Chastello's description, amiable, she was in the habit of retiring early and seems to have been depressed, as she was, in Chastello's words, expecting her confinement at any moment in the pregnancy that would finally kill her. Chastellux and Jefferson stayed up after Mrs. Jefferson had gone to bed, talking about, among other topics, their mutual enthusiasm for the poems of Ossian, about which more more later. Martha gave birth in May for the last time and died in September. Jefferson, who attended her for 4 months continually as she declined, was prostrate with grief upon his wife's death. This has provided a dramatic scene in many of Jefferson's biographies, though his obvious agency in her repeated pregnancies has often gone circumspectly unmentioned, meaning he kept her pregnant and he birthed her to death. There is no clue in Jefferson's papers that he saw himself as playing any part in his wife's death through continual impregnation, in the face of her continually weakening condition, despite Jefferson's clear awareness of what we now call family planning. As per his description of Native American women in Notes on the State of Virginia, the women frequently attending the men in their parties of war and hunting, childbearing becomes extremely inconvenient to them. It was said, therefore, that they have learnt the practice of procuring abortion by the use of some vegetable, and that it even extends to prevent conception for a considerable time after. Let us be clear that we are not guilty of the present day bugaboo presentium, but by noting that women in Jefferson's day were expected to be pregnant constantly. Our point is to call attention to the difference between the mindset of Jefferson's world and that of ours. It was commonly considered a woman's duty to produce babies nonstop, whether it killed them or not. We differ, however, at the interpretation offered by John Meacham, who suggests that Martha Wells Jefferson's fatal continuum of pregnancy. Meacham suggests that she may also have had tuberculosis, was evidence of no shortage of physical passion between them. We propose an alternate interpretation that her repeated debilitating pregnancies might be evidence that a dutiful wife had no right to say no. On her deathbed, according to the later recollections of the enslaved women who attended her while dying, she exacted an oath from Jefferson never to remarry, which would have been which would have compromised their daughter's inheritance. But we don't know what Martha Wells Jefferson thought, confined to die in her bed on that isolated mountaintop. Jefferson, so conscious of his own immortality, through writing, burned her letters, thus erasing her voice from historical memory. We have not even a picture of her. The forlorn widower returned to public life, accepting the appointment to serve the presidentless, moneyless American Confederation as U.S. miniature plenipotentiary. basically the trade representative to France in 1784, where he remained until 1789. John Adams, who, unlike Jefferson, was an experienced diplomat, performed the same function in London. Chastellux, who helped get Jefferson's daughter Patsy into a good school in Paris, published a 1786 an account of his travels that helped promote the Jefferson mystique in France. An early flash of the enduring legend of the mountaintop sage of Monticello. In it, he noted the abject condition of Virginia's poor whites and connected it to the Virginia slave owners' desire for increase by saying, "Greetings, forecast. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm glad you're here." So Chastellux wrote, "Humanity suffers from the state of poverty in which a great number of white people in Virginia. It is in this state for the first time since I crossed the sea that I have seen poor people. For among these rich plantations, where the Negro alone is wretched, one often finds miserable huts inhabited by whites whose wan looks and ragged garments bespeak poverty. I have since learned that all these useless lands and those immense estates with which Virginia is still covered have their proprietors. Nothing is more common than to see them possessing 5 or 6 thousand acres of land, but exploiting only as much of it as their Negroes can cultivate. Yet they will not give it away or even sell the smallest portion of it because they are attached to their possessions and always hope to eventually increase the numbers of their Negroes." In Paris, where printing was much cheaper than in America, Jefferson in 1785 privately published Notes on the State of Virginia, first drafted in 1781 as an answer on the part of Virginia to the questionnaire put to the various states by Francois de Barbie Marbois, the secretary of the French legation to the United States. The only book Jefferson ever published, it was intended to pitch the wonders of his state to the wealthy French. Jefferson printed 200 copies privately and semi-anonymously. The author was M. Monsieur for individual distribution in elite circles only. So, similar to what Donald Trump is doing today by trying to offer a golden visa to the wealthy, Thomas Jefferson was doing the same thing. When he sent one to James Madison, he wrote, perhaps disingenuously, "I shall only send over a very few copies to particular friends in confidence and burn the rest. In no case do I propose to admit them to go to the public at large." But they did. A French bookseller who acquired a copy after its owner unexpectedly died jobbed it out to a hireling translator and published it in French in 1786. The book was favorably reviewed in the Mercure de France, who proclaimed the barely anonymous author a philosopher. Jefferson, who disliked the translation, then allowed his English version to be published in London of the following year. In composing what amounted to be an intellectual investment prospectus for the state he represented, Jefferson faced the problem of having to explain to the French why the enslaved of his country would never be freed. Most of his friends in France were abolitionists who expected the post revolutionary United States to bring slavery to an end. But Jefferson's Virginia countrymen overwhelmingly had no intention of ever freeing their slaves and thus losing their property, and were touchy about the issue. Jefferson did not make the true argument, which would have been that he and his relatives, friends, and constituents would be paupers without slaves. Rather, his justification was that the Negro was inferior, something he seems to have truly believed, and moreover dangerous, and therefore had to be kept in a state of slavery for everybody's good. This problem, as Jefferson insisted throughout his career, was due not to the greed of the colonists themselves, but to British insistence on imposing slavery on the colonies in the first place, leaving the wealthy of Virginia no chance and no choice. So went the story. But to the soldier on with which their white man's burden of ever increasing human property. It's not an oversimplification to say that Jefferson despised blackness. The most inflammatory quote from the notes has been frequently reprinted in recent years after being largely overlooked, and we too will include it here for the purposes of clarity, with apologies to the reader. So, Jefferson was a rabid racist. The difference of the Negro is fixed in nature and is as real as if its seat and cause were better known to us. And is this difference of no importance? Is it not the foundation of a greater or less share of beauty in the two races? Are not the fine mixtures of red and white the expressions of every passion, by greater or less suffusions of color, in the one preferable to that eternal monotony which reigns in the countenances, that immovable veil of black which covers all emotions of the other race? Add to these a flowing hair, a more elegant symmetry of form, their own judgment in favor of whites, declared by their preference of them, as uniformly as it is the preference of the Orotun for the black woman who over those of his own species. With this evocation of the Ornuntan copulating with black women, Jefferson provides an early instance of the fundamental racist trope that Felipe Smith calls the ape libel. Because Negroes were an inferior race, Jefferson argued, they could not be freed. To do so would require their immediate deportation, he insisted, in order to avoid amalgamation that would stain the purity of the detected in the white race. He continued by saying, this unfortunate difference in color and perhaps the faculty is a powerful obstacle to the emancipation of these people. The Roman slave, when made free, might mix with without staining the blood of his master. But with us, in America, a second is necessary, unknown to history. When freed, he is to be removed beyond the reach of mixture. The notion of racism did not yet exist. The French term racism was coined in the late 19th century. But if this call to maintain purity of blood is not racism, the word has no meaning. James Madison, who never freed any of his slaves in life or death, was a racist of the same stripe. He believed abolition impossible because of the physical peculiarities of those held in bondage, which preclude their incorporation with the white population. Basically, they believed that because we are black, and because when you mix black with anything, it also becomes black, then amalgamation, integration, miscegenation could not solve this problem because there was no way to mix white and get white with black and get white. You mix black with white and you get mulatto, you get a lot of other things, but you do not get white when you mix black with anything. With notes on the state of Virginia, Jefferson definitively established himself as a founding theorist of white supremacy in America, laying out in condensed form key points of racialized thought that pro slavery writers would consistently reaffirm and that would echo in the cant of modern day white supremacists. He linked his ideas to a deportation scheme that was, in effect, a foolproof way to avoid ending slavery. Though he didn't package it like that, quite to the contrary, he pitched his impossible project as the only way slavery could be ended. Jefferson insisted that manumission required the immediate deportation of the emancipated. This would be necessary, Jefferson explained, in order to avoid convulsions which would probably never end, but in the extermination of one race or the other. So, from Jefferson's perspective, we would kill each other rather than see each other free. Interesting, right? This is the founder, the framer that people want to quote and want to highlight those ideas and bring his ideas back to life. To avoid this conjectured race war of annihilation, emancipation required what is now called ethnic cleansing. Jefferson stamped that demand with a founder's seal and a philosopher's sigh. The reviewer for the Mercury waxed enthusiastic about Jefferson's solution for the problem of slavery. That Jefferson would consider emancipation under any circumstances and would speak badly of slavery, even in abstract terms, was enough to trip the hair trigger anger of many American slave owners, which is perhaps why he had wanted to keep the book off the general market. It cost him some political support, especially in South Carolina. Jefferson's plan was to deport flotillas of black youth in wave after wave, year after year. He would, by degrees, send the whole of that population from among us until the race itself was gone, and simultaneously replace them with white immigrant laborers. Aren't we dealing with this ideology today? A plan for total removal that did not acknowledge the presence in the United States of free people of color. In notes on the state of Virginia, Jefferson proposed that they should continue with their parents to a certain age, then be brought up at the public expense to tillage, arts, or sciences according to their geniuses. To the females should be 18 and the males 21 years of age, when they should be colonized to such place as the circumstances of the time should render most proper, sending them out with arms, implements of household, and of the handicraft arts, beads, pairs of useful domestic animals, etc., to declare them free and independent people, and to extend to them our alliance and protection till they have acquired strength, and to send vessels at the same time to other parts of the world for an equal number of white inhabitants, to induce whom to migrate hither, prosperous encouragements were to be proposed. So he wanted to send out the young black people that had been educated and brought up by their parents, leaving their parents here to work and toil away until death as fully enslaved, but giving their children freely away to these white people that would send them to another continent with some training and some resources. And then he wanted to import white people from all over the world into America. Isn't that what we see happening now? I'm just asking. To better understand what Jefferson had in mind, we flash forward to February 4th, 1824, in a letter he wrote to Jared Sparks, the Unitarian minister who published the North American Review. In it, the 84-year-old Jefferson outlined a scheme for accomplishing the colonization that would rid the United States of its proliferating African Americans once and for all, before they got any more numerous, and proposed a timetable for accomplishing the expulsion of about a sixth of the nation's population. In the North American Review, he wrote, there are in the U.S. 1.5 million people of color in slavery. To send off the whole of these at once, nobody conceives to be practicable for us or expedient for them. Let us take 25 years for its accomplishment, within which time they will be doubled, their estimated value as property in the first place, for actual property has been lawfully vested in that form, and who can lawfully take from his possessors. At an average of $200 each, young and old, would amount to 600 millions of dollars, which must be paid or lost by somebody. So he was still only concerned with how much value these enslaved people brought to these people that held them as slaves. Jefferson went on to propose the creation of a fund financed by the sale of Western lands for purchasing infants on the cheap, raising them as wards of the state, and deporting them to St. Domingo. He did not ever use the name Haiti, but he suggested the estimated value of the newborn infant is so low, let's say $12.50, that it would probably be yielded by the owner's get gratis, and would thus reduce the 600 millions of dollars, the first head of expense, to 37 million and a half, leaving only the expense of nourishment while with the mother, and of transportation. Jefferson calculated that though it would take 25 years to accomplish the entire project, by the last 9 years, the number of breeders, the word that he used, would have diminished considerably because you had sent off all the women of childbearing age. He imagined a fleet of 50 vessels recursively sailing away full of black youth and coming back empty for more until every last one of them was gone. Suppose the whole annual increase to be 60,000 effective birth, 50 vessels of 400 tons burthen each, constantly employed in the short run, that would carry off the increase every year, and the old stock would die off in the ordinary course of nature because you worked them to death, lessening from the commencement until its final disappearance. In this way, no violation of private right is proposed. The private right that Jefferson is talking about was, of course, that of all those men who were created equal. Black people did not have the private right, but separating them from their children was not all that bad, thought Jefferson, because he explained in the notes on Virginia, their griefs are transient because they weren't allowed to grieve. Their numberless, their numberless afflictions, which render it doubtful whether heaven has given life to us in mercy or in wrath, are less felt and sooner forgotten with them. So he's saying black people didn't feel the same pains that white people would have felt had they been separated from their children. In general, their existence appears to participate more sensation than reflection. So basically, what he's saying is that we were more sensuous creatures, more liable to things, the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life, versus the sentimentalities of family and friends and having relationships. But that's because we were forced into that position. This was the classic rationalization for minimizing the damage caused by systematically destroying African American families, and it was a libel. Being simple creatures, they get over it. Accordingly, Jefferson concluded his letter to Sparks saying, the separation of infants from their mothers would produce some scruples of humanity, but this would be straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel. Were the United States not purged of its black people soon, Jefferson warned Sparks, the demographics guaranteed armed slave resistance. 1.5 million are within slave owners' control, but 6 millions, which a majority of those now living will see them attain, and 1 million of these fighting men will say, we will not go. This did, in fact, happen, though the numbers are different. There were 4 million enslaved African Americans in 1860, not 6 million. So our natural increase didn't happen as rapidly as he thought. And they were officially 186,097 soldiers and sailors who fought in the U.S. Navy and Army against the Confederacy, in effect saying, we will not go. Confiscate all African American children from their mothers and ship them off to thrive or die. That was Jefferson's vision of a final solution to the Negro problem. Presumably, such a massive expulsion as Jefferson contemplated would have required a fully totalitarian state apparatus to implement and would have resulted in the death of many of the deported. Mortality rates were high in the few miserable colonization attempts that were made. Jefferson had not suddenly gone mad in his dotage. This had been his idea all along, so he explains to Sparks. This was the result of my reflections on the subject 5 and 40 years ago, and I have never been able to conceive any other practicable plan. It was also sketched in the notes on Virginia under the 14th query. If this kind of massive deportation couldn't be achieved, he insisted throughout his career, emancipation could not take place. This conviction would be strengthened by the Haitian Revolution that erupted in 1791 and by Gabriel's unenacted rebellion of 1800 and would be taken as gospel by pro slavery Southerners. It would spur the founding of the American Colonization Society, whose ostensible mission was to deport all free people of color. Having outlined the physical reason for the exile in notes, Jefferson proceeded to the moral reason pursuant to which he had described in a long list of inferiorities attributed to them, which we will not quote here. This was perfectly in line with the thinking of many European intellectuals. Scientific racism. Citing David Hume, the leading light of the Scottish Enlightenment, Immanuel Kant had written The Observations on the Feeling of the Beautiful and the Sublime, written in 1764, that the Negroes of Africa have by nature no feeling that arises above the trifling. Mr. Hume challenges anyone to cite a single example in which a Negro has shown talents and assets and asserts that among the hundreds of thousands of blacks who are transported elsewhere from their countries, etc. But the point was less urgent to Kant, whose wealth did not consist of black people, than to Jefferson and Madison. A mere 75 years later, as the Southern states left the Union, pro secessionist radicals argued to their unconvinced countrymen some of the same points as Jefferson's. The Negro was inferior and not equal to whites. Emancipation would result in a race war to the death, or in the purity of the white race being sullied by the horror of mongrelization, and slave owners' property rights must be respected. There was, however, a solution of sorts to the perceived problem of black overpopulation, and it was highly profitable. If Virginia's black people could not be emancipated and deported, they could be sold away into the new territories. All the states had prohibited the African slave trade by the time non importation cut off exterior commerce during the independence struggle. So Africans had not been entering the colonies for years. With independence achieved, South Carolina and Georgia, whose labor forces had massively taken flight or died, reopened their slave trades. As Charlestown's slave market boomed, it changed its name in 1783 to the less regal Charleston. According to James McMillan, between 1783 and 1787, nearly 100 Charleston merchants handled slave sales ranging from one person to cargoes of more than 400 Africans. But there was soon a glut on the market as slaves from multiple territories, most numerously British, but also from Rhode Island, tried to get in on the action, depressing or lowering the point of sale prices in America and raising point of supply prices in Africa. The slave trade continued being a cash business for the captains who brought in cargoes, so an intermediate class of British factors, still very much active in the independent republic, brokered the sales to the planters on easy terms with up to 2 years to pay. Though some of the factors became wealthy, there wasn't much money coming into the territory. A large market for American indigo died with independence, never to return, because Britain ended the subsidy that made it profitable. The rice economy recovered only slowly. A boom in slave sales meant a debt problem as well. The eagerness of planters to buy slaves drained the supply of specie from the economy, and many individuals were carrying excessive debt burdens. The great quantity of Negroes now pouring in upon us, occasions every planter to wish an increase of his stock, said Thomas B. before the South Carolina inquiry into the state of the Republic in 1785. The sight of a Negro yard was too great a temptation for a planter to withstand. He could not leave without purchasing it. In short, there seemed to be a rage for Negroes without any consideration of how they were to be paid for. Because, like easy credit, if they could pay for the Negroes, they would often die before they were paid off because they were worked to death in some of these instances. These planters thought that they could get 2 years of basically free labor out of these Negroes before they were paid off. Then Charleston's economy crashed, and in 1787, drowning in debt, the South Carolina legislature prohibited slave importation after a spirited debate. South Carolina's closure of the foreign slave trade increased the traffic to Georgia, where the trade remained open until 1798, with an illicit trade continuing afterward. More Africans entered Georgia after independence than before, but not so many as the planters would have liked. Less credit was available to Georgia planters from merchants, so the state's economy incurred less of a debt burden than it might have. But since less labor was imported, production came back only slowly. During Georgia's period of importation, two revolutionary developments charted the nation's course. In Philadelphia, the Constitution. In Savannah, the sawtooth cotton gin. So as you can see, these people only looked at people as black people as property. They never, in the framers' documents, they never expected black people to be included in the all men are created equal portion of that statement. They didn't even expect Native Americans to be included in the all men are created equal portion of that statement. They expected that to only apply to propertied white men. And you have to get that through your head when you're looking at these documents and you're expecting these people to grant you the same rights and positions that white people have. And the wealthy class of white people will gladly um the wealthier class of white people will gladly sacrifice the poor class of white people. All right, Sister Raw. I didn't mean to go so long. I started really late. She's getting ready to go to bed. I appreciate you and I value you. Thank you for all your contributions to this broadcast. I'm getting ready to get off. Um, I want to thank each and every one of you for listening tonight. I want to thank the forecast and Sister Ron, the elders that listen with her. I want to thank Bawana Haguziki, Justin Liebert, KW Don 7, Manning for Mayor, Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, Oni from the Pro Black Perspective, Anthony McPhail, Afro Native, the Farafi People, Confidence Okiki, Dorito Cooper, and everyone else that listens. I value each and every one of you for listening, and I thank you for coming on and sharing and spending this time with me. Just remember, rich white people will sacrifice poor white people to continue to keep black people oppressed. Rich white people convince poor white people that their whiteness is better than blackness. And that's why they can continue to convince poor white people to align with them against black people because they have poor white people convinced that your whiteness is something you can trade on. But once poor white people realize that the rich white people don't care about them, then revolution happens. Just remember that. And remember, Thomas Jefferson never expected Black people or Native Americans to be included in his Declaration of Independence. And all of those flowery words that they say, and in all of those high minded ideas that they express, they never wanted people of color, Black people. They never wanted unpropertied white men. They never wanted women. They never wanted foreigners. They never wanted anyone but propertied, wealthy people to come into this country and have the right to vote. That's why it's important that you vote. It's important that you participate in the political process because that's the one thing that they never wanted. And if we don't participate in political processes, then they will take us back to enslavement because that's when they were wealthiest, when they could force us to do what they wanted us to do. And then they made these plans for our children to separate us from our children after quote unquote training them and buying them at a young age and putting them in state institutions and then sending them off and away from us. Our greatest hope should not be that I can't be free. Hopefully, my children will be free. Our greatest hope should be I'm going to fight for the freedom of myself and my children. I appreciate each and every one of you for being here. I thank you for listening. I will be back Thursday with the reading of Brainwashed. I'm sorry that I've been off. I've had some personal things happen, but everything is okay. Everything is settling down. I will see you on Thursday. Peace, guys.